Welcome to our screencast on text complexity. My name is Emily Hofer, and I'm the Director of Literacy Best Practices at the Achievement Network. Our objectives for this screencast are to understand what text complexity is and why it's important, and to become familiar with a process for determining text complexity. Our intended audience is any teacher or leader interested in learning more about text complexity, and the content in our screencast is most applicable to those who teach or support grades 2 through 8. Here is our agenda for this screencast. You can see that we'll work through the answers to several questions that you may have about text complexity. We'll begin by making a case for why text complexity is important. Next, we'll talk about what text complexity is and how to define a text complexity. And we'll close by naming next steps related to text complexity. Appendix A of the Common Core Standards tells us that demands on readers have increased over the last 50 years, while at the same time, K-12 reading texts have actually trended downward in difficulty. The authors of the Common Core recognized this problem and readjusted what students need to be reading in each grade level to be college and career ready. If you're interested in reading more on this topic, I recommend that you review Appendix A of the Common Core Standards. A pop-up to this resource is appearing on your screen now. We can see these new expectations for increasing text complexity reflected in the Common Core shifts and standards. On your screen, you're seeing the three big shifts in literacy in Common Core. Pause your screencast now to read each one. The third shift explicitly calls out complex text. And remember, these shifts derive right from the standards themselves. Here you're seeing the connection from this third shift to Anchor Standard 10, which tells us that students need to be reading complex texts independently and proficiently. Now let's take a look at Standard 10 more closely. On your screen, you can see an abridged vertical progression of Reading Standard 10 from grades 2 through 8. You may recall that Standard 10 ultimately has an impact on all other standards, because regardless of which additional standards that students are engaging with, they need to be doing so using appropriately complex texts. Pause your screencast now to read through this abridged vertical progression. As you can see, the Common Core standards are clear about what students need to do at each grade level by the end of the year. We'll talk more about what the text complexity bands are for each grade level as defined by Common Core later in this screencast. Now that we've spent some time talking about why text complexity is important, let's dig into what text complexity actually is and how to determine a text complexity. Text complexity is basically how easy or hard a text is to read. Appendix A of the Common Core Standards defines text complexity along three dimensions: quantitative, qualitative, and reader and task. The quantitative dimension is one that is difficult or impossible for a human to determine. It's typically measured by a computer and tells us about a text's word length and frequency, sentence length, and the text's readability. Lexile level is one form of quantitative measurement. The qualitative dimension is best measured or only measurable by an attentive human reader. It includes elements such as levels of meaning or purpose, structure, language conventionality and clarity, and knowledge demands. Reader and task refers to variables specific to particular readers, such as motivation, knowledge, and experiences, and to particular tasks, such as purpose and the complexity of the task assigned and the questions posed. This dimension of text complexity relies on teacher judgment and expertise. It's a combination of these three dimensions that now define how complex a text is or isn't. Now we're going to walk you through a do-it-yourself approach that you can use to determine a text's complexity. This approach can help you to become deeply familiar with a text, which is critical in planning for Common Core literacy instruction. Pause your screencast now to read through each of these steps, and we'll work through each of them with an example in a moment. Let's use The Grapes of Wrath for our example. Some of you may have read the book, but don't worry, it's not necessary to have read it to understand the model that I'll share with you now. The Grapes of Wrath is a novel about the Great Depression that chronicles the Dust Bowl migration of the 1930s. Let's walk through this text looking at the three dimensions of text complexity we just discussed to deepen our understanding of each. Let's start by considering the quantitative dimension. As we just discussed, lexile level is one measure to determine a text's quantitative complexity. On your screen, you can see the lexile ranges aligned to the Common Core standards for each grade band. The Grapes of Wrath's lexile level is 680, which puts it within the 2nd to 3rd grade band. John Steinbeck, who wrote The Grapes of Wrath, is well known for his simple writing style. His writing has simple sentence structure and language, which accounts for this lexile placement. But does this mean that we would want to teach this book in 2nd grade? No, and here's why. The topics and themes that Steinbeck captures in this book are far from simple, and that's why we have a multidimensional model for considering text complexity. So now let's move on to consider step 2, analyzing the qualitative elements of a text. As we mentioned, there are 4 qualitative elements that make a text more or less difficult for a student: purpose, structure, language, and knowledge demands. The qualitative measures of text complexity purposefully consider parts of the text that we may have overlooked in the past. Now let's think about where The Grapes of Wrath falls in terms of its qualitative complexity. Pause your screencast now to read through a description of each of these elements of qualitative complexity. This is a high-level analysis of the qualitative complexity of The Grapes of Wrath and can help us make decisions about whether it's at the right level of complexity for a particular grade level. If you're completing a qualitative analysis to inform your lesson level planning, you'd want to zoom into a smaller piece of the text and really dig into each dimension to give you a more robust picture of where students might struggle. While you don't need a rubric to determine a text's qualitative complexity, you may want one to reference to help you. If you wish, click on the pop-ups on your screen now to view the rubrics on the Student Achievement Partners website. One tip I'll offer if you choose to use a rubric is that it's less important to focus on exactly which complexity rating you'd assign to the text. Instead, focus in on which specific elements within the text would make it challenging for students. So now that we've considered the quantitative and qualitative elements of this text complexity, we can now tentatively suggest the grade band it would make sense to place it in. Though considered easy by many quantitative measures, The Grapes of Wrath has a sophistication of theme and content and lends itself to high-level literary and historical analysis. Our qualitative analysis therefore indicates that this book is not appropriate for 2nd or 3rd grade classrooms and would be best suited to high schoolers. Let's move on to looking at the last dimension, reader and task. When we evaluate texts along this dimension, we should consider the students and tasks we're going to ask. Considering where the text has landed using the qualitative and quantitative measures, you'd want to design tasks that mirror this grade band. When you think about the reader, you should consider their motivation, knowledge, and experience. We recommend that you use your expertise to design scaffolded and increasingly rigorous grade-level tasks. On your screen, you see 3 sample tasks that you could ask students about the Grapes of Wrath. Pause your screencast now to read each and consider which one might be best suited for students in grades 9 and 10. The high rigor task might be more appropriate for 12th grade or college level students, while the low rigor task likely wouldn't push students to fully engage with all this text has to offer. So we'd likely want to provide students with a task like the one in the middle. So now that we've considered each dimension of this text complexity, we can finally fully recommend placement in the appropriate text complexity band. Earlier, we tentatively recommended that we place this text in the high school grade band. I think that recommendation still makes sense. And in this case, we can confirm our thinking via Common Core Appendix B, which places the Grapes of Wrath in the grades 9 to 10 band. If you're interested in reading more about the texts that Common Core has selected as exemplars for appropriate complexity in each grade level, click on the pop-up on your screen now. This will take you directly to Appendix B. Now we'd like to suggest 2 next steps for you to take after this screencast. The first next step we recommend is to use the 4-step process we discussed today to evaluate one text you're considering using in upcoming instruction. In particular, we recommend that you prioritize conducting a qualitative analysis of your text. Deeply understanding where a text is more or less complex will help you determine where you want to spend time with your students making meaning of those complex sections. A good long-term goal would be to create or leverage a gradated text set, which is a group of texts on a similar topic or theme that start out at lower levels of complexity and scaffold to allow students to work up to higher levels of complexity. This approach can help your struggling readers gain access to more complex texts over time. Click the pop-up on your screen now to see an example of what a gradated text set looks like. I hope you are leaving with some ideas about how you can take this information about text complexity back to your classroom or school. Thanks for joining us for this screencast.